I woke up that morning not knowing it would be the last time I'd ever walk into that house as someone's wife. My name is Emma. I'm 28 years old, and I've spent the last 4 years of my life trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law, the perfect wife, the perfect version of myself that would finally be enough for Marcus and his family. But on that Tuesday afternoon in March, standing in the living room of their suburban home in Atlanta with spit dripping down my cheek, I realized that no amount of perfection would ever matter to people who had already decided I was worthless. What I didn't know then was that the phone call I was about to make would change everything. Not just for me, but for every single person in that room who thought they could humiliate me and walk away unscathed. Let me take you back 6 hours before that moment, before the spit, before the silence, before everything fell apart and somehow came together all at once. I had driven to Marcus's childhood home that morning because his mother, Patricia, had called me the night before insisting we needed to have a family meeting. Her voice on the phone had that edge to it, that particular sharpness that I'd learned to recognize over the years as a warning sign. But I went anyway, because that's what I always did. I showed up. I smiled. I tried to smooth things over. I convinced myself that this time would be different. The Atlanta traffic was heavy that morning, the kind of thick, humid heat that makes your clothes stick to your skin, even with the air conditioning on full blast. I remember gripping the steering wheel and practicing deep breaths, telling myself to stay calm, to not react, to be the bigger person no matter what happened. When I pulled up to the house, a sprawling ranch-style place in one of those neighborhoods where every lawn looks the same and everyone knows everyone else's business, I could see Marcus's truck already in the driveway. His sister Jennifer's silver SUV was parked right next to it. My stomach tightened because I knew what this meant. This wasn't just a casual family gathering. This was an ambush, and I was walking straight into it. I sat in my car for a moment, staring at the house with its perfectly maintained garden and its American flag hanging by the front door, and I almost turned around and drove away. But I didn't, because part of me still believed that if I just tried hard enough, if I just explained myself clearly enough, they would finally see me as human. If you're listening to this story and feeling that knot in your stomach because you've been in a situation like this, where you knew something bad was coming but you walked into it anyway, I want you to do something for me right now. Click that subscribe button below this video. Seriously, take 2 seconds and hit subscribe, because we're building a community here of people who understand what it's like to survive these moments, and I want you to be part of it. We're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and every single one of you matters in making that happen. I walked up to the front door and knocked, even though Marcus had given me a key years ago. Something about the situation made me feel like I didn't belong there anymore, like I needed permission to enter. Patricia opened the door wearing one of her floral blouses and that smile that never quite reached her eyes. She'd never liked me from the moment Marcus brought me home for the first time. I was too independent, too career-focused, too opinionated. I didn't come from the right kind of family. My parents were immigrants who had worked their way up from nothing, and somehow that made me less than in her eyes, even though she'd never say it outright. It was always there in the small comments, the little digs about my accent, my cooking, the way I dressed, the fact that I'd kept my last name when we got married. The living room was exactly as I remembered it, with the same beige sectional sofa and the family photos covering every available surface. Marcus was sitting in his father's old recliner, which he always did when he wanted to feel powerful, like he was the man of the house. Jennifer was perched on the arm of the sofa, filing her nails like she had all the time in the world. Patricia gestured for me to sit, and I chose a spot on the opposite end of the sectional, as far from everyone as I could get. The air in that room felt thick and hostile, like walking into a wall of resentment. Patricia started talking first, her voice syrupy sweet in that way that Southern women do when they're about to destroy you. She said we needed to discuss some concerns about the marriage, about my priorities, about whether I was really committed to being part of this family. I remember thinking how strange it was that we were having a conversation about my marriage, without my husband actually participating. Just sitting there silent in that chair while his mother spoke for him. That should have been my first clue about how deep the rot went. But I'd been making excuses for Marcus for so long that I'd lost the ability to see him clearly. Jennifer chimed in next, saying she'd been talking to Marcus and he'd been really unhappy lately, really struggling with my attitude and my selfishness. She started listing things I'd apparently done wrong. I'd refused to quit my job when Marcus asked me to. I'd insisted on keeping separate bank accounts. I'd pushed back when Patricia tried to dictate how we should decorate our home. I dared to suggest that maybe we should spend Christmas with my family for once instead of always coming here. Each accusation felt like a slap, and I could feel my heart racing, my hands starting to shake. But I kept my voice steady when I responded, explaining that I'd never refused to compromise. I'd just asked to be treated like an equal partner instead of a servant. That's when Marcus finally spoke up, and his voice had this cold contempt in it that I'd never heard before. Or maybe I had, but I'd been too afraid to acknowledge it. He said I was delusional if I thought I brought anything equal to this marriage. He said his family had been right about me from the beginning, that I was selfish and ungrateful, and that he'd wasted 4 years of his life trying to fix me. I remember the room starting to spin a little, the way it does when your body realizes something your mind hasn't quite accepted yet. This wasn't a conversation or even an argument. This was a public execution, and I was the only one who hadn't known it was scheduled. I tried to defend myself, tried to explain that a marriage was supposed to be a partnership, that I'd given up so much already, that I'd bent over backwards trying to make everyone happy. My voice was shaking now, and I hated myself for showing weakness in front of them, but I couldn't help it. I talked about all the times I'd bitten my tongue when Patricia criticized me, all the family events I'd attended even when I was exhausted from working double shifts, all the ways I'd tried to be enough for a man who apparently saw me as a project to be fixed rather than a person to be loved. And you know what? If you're sitting there right now feeling angry on my behalf, feeling that fire in your chest because you know exactly what it's like to be torn down by the people who are supposed to love you, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We're building something here, a space where these stories matter, where your experience matters. Help us get to 1,000 subscribers by clicking that red button right now. Your support means everything. Marcus stood up from that chair, and I remember noticing how much taller he seemed when he was looking down at me like that, when he had his mother and sister as backup. He started yelling then, really yelling, about how I was an embarrassment to him, how I'd never respected his family, how I thought I was better than everyone else because I had a college degree and a career. He said I was cold and difficult and impossible to please. He said his mother had warned him about women like me, women who pretend to be sweet until they trap you in marriage and then show their true colors. I stood up too, because I wasn't going to let him tower over me like that, wasn't going to give him that power. I told him that if he was so unhappy, maybe we should talk about separation. The word hung in the air like a bomb, and I could see Patricia's face go red, could see Jennifer's eyes widen. But Marcus just laughed, this awful, bitter sound that made my skin crawl. He said I'd never survive on my own, that I needed him more than he needed me, that I was nothing without the stability his family provided. That's when I made my biggest mistake. Or maybe it was the smartest thing I ever did, depending on how you look at it. I told them all exactly what I thought. I told Patricia that she was a controlling, manipulative woman who had raised a son with no spine, who couldn't make a decision without checking with Mommy first. I told Jennifer that she was a bitter, jealous person who'd spent her whole life living in her brother's shadow and taking her insecurities out on other women. And I told Marcus that he was a coward who'd never loved me, who'd just wanted someone to play house with while his mother pulled the strings. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, could hear someone's phone buzzing in another room, could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Marcus's face had gone completely white, then red, then almost purple. I'd never seen anyone look so angry, so consumed by rage that they seemed to stop being human for a moment. He took 2 steps toward me, and I actually backed up, suddenly very aware that I was alone in a room with 3 people who clearly despised me. What happened next? I've replayed in my mind 1,000 times, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand how 4 years of marriage could lead to that single moment. Marcus stood right in front of me, so close I could smell his cologne, the same one I'd bought him for his birthday last year. He looked me dead in the eyes, and then he gathered spit in his mouth and launched it directly onto my face. I felt it hit my cheek, warm and disgusting, and for a second I couldn't process what had just happened. My brain couldn't catch up to the reality that my husband, the man I'd shared a bed with for 4 years, had just spit on me like I was garbage on the street. But what happened next was somehow worse than the spit itself. Patricia started clapping. Slow, deliberate claps like she was applauding a performance. And then Jennifer joined in, and they were both sitting there clapping and smiling while their son and brother stood in front of his wife with hatred in his eyes and spit on her face. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there with that disgusting wetness on my cheek, staring at these 3 people who were supposed to be my family, and something inside me broke. Not in a sad way, not in a defeated way, but in a way that cleared out all the fog, and all the excuses, and all the desperate hope that had been clouding my judgment for years. Before we continue with what happened next, and trust me, you're not going to believe what I did with just 1 phone call, I need you to pause for just 2 seconds and hit that subscribe button. We're almost at 1,000 subscribers, and every single person who subscribes helps us build this community of survivors, of people who refuse to be treated like garbage by anyone. Click subscribe right now, then come back and hear the rest of the story, because it's about to get very, very interesting. I reached up and wiped the spit off my face with the back of my hand, and I didn't say a word. Not a single word. I just turned around and walked toward the door, moving like I was underwater, like everything was happening in slow motion. Patricia called after me, her voice sharp, asking where I thought I was going, telling me we weren't finished. But I kept walking. I opened that front door, stepped out into the humid Atlanta afternoon, and closed it behind me very gently, very deliberately. I walked to my car, got in, closed the door, and sat there for a moment in the silence. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my phone out of my purse. But I managed it, scrolling through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. David Chen, the senior partner at the law firm where I worked as a paralegal. David was also Marcus's boss at the engineering firm, though Marcus didn't know that David and I worked in the same building, that we'd had coffee together dozens of times, that I knew things about the company that Marcus thought were secret. I hit call and waited, watching the front door of the house, wondering if any of them would come after me. David picked up on the second ring, his voice warm and concerned when I said hello. I told him I needed to tell him something important, something about Marcus and the projects he'd been working on. You see, Marcus had been stealing from his company for the past 6 months, skimming money off budgets and falsifying reports to cover his tracks. I'd found the evidence completely by accident 3 months ago when I'd used his laptop and stumbled across files he'd forgotten to password protect. I'd been so shocked, so horrified, and when I'd confronted him about it, he'd convinced me that it was complicated, that I didn't understand business, that everyone did things like this, and it wasn't really stealing. He'd made me promise not to tell anyone, said it would destroy his career and our life together if anyone found out. And like an idiot, I'd kept that promise because I'd still believed in him, still thought we could work through anything. But sitting in that car with spit still damp on my sleeve, I realized I didn't owe him anything anymore. I didn't owe any of them anything. So I told David everything. I told him about the falsified reports, the diverted funds, the emails Marcus had sent to contractors asking them to inflate invoices so he could pocket the difference. I told him I had copies of everything on a thumb drive at home, and I could have it to him within the hour. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like forever. Then David's voice came back, hard and professional, all the warmth gone. He thanked me for my integrity in coming forward, said he'd be making some calls immediately, and asked if I was safe. That last question made me want to cry, because it was the first time in that entire horrible day that anyone had asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, that I was leaving, and he said he'd be in touch. The call lasted maybe 3 minutes total, but in those 3 minutes, I'd just ended Marcus's career, his reputation, and quite possibly kept him out of prison, only because David was a merciful man who might give him a chance to resign quietly instead of pressing charges. I was still sitting in my car when the front door of the house burst open, and Marcus came running out, phone pressed to his ear, face even more purple than before. I could see Patricia and Jennifer crowding in the doorway behind him, trying to hear what was happening. I started my engine and put the car in reverse, but I rolled down my window just enough to hear Marcus screaming into his phone, his voice cracking with panic. I couldn't make out all the words, but I heard enough to know that David had moved fast, that Marcus was already getting calls about an emergency meeting, that everything was crumbling around him in real time. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw Marcus turn and look at me, and the expression on his face was something I'll never forget. It was shock and rage and fear all mixed together. The realization that the woman he'd just spit on had just destroyed his entire life with a single phone call. I didn't smile or wave or gloat. I just looked at him for one long moment, then turned my eyes back to the road and drove away. Now, I know some of you are listening to this and thinking about times when you wanted to stand up for yourself, but didn't know how. Times when you let people treat you badly, because you were afraid of the consequences. If that's you, if you're feeling empowered by this story, then show your support by subscribing to this channel. Hit that button and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Be part of a community that believes in standing up and fighting back when people try to tear you down. The drive home felt surreal, like I was watching myself from outside my body. I kept expecting to feel guilty, or scared, or regretful. But all I felt was this incredible lightness, like I'd been carrying a weight for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. My phone started ringing when I was about 10 minutes from home, Marcus's name flashing on the screen. I declined the call. He called again, declined. Again, declined. He called 17 times in the span of 30 minutes, and I declined every single one. When I got home to our apartment, the place I'd spent 4 years trying to make into a home, even though Marcus had never let me hang a single picture without his mother's approval, I walked straight to the bedroom and pulled out the suitcase from the top shelf of the closet. I started packing, moving mechanically, grabbing clothes and toiletries and important documents. I wasn't thinking about where I would go or what would happen next. I was just moving forward, one action at a time, putting distance between myself and the life I'd been living. My phone rang again, but this time it was Patricia's number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Her voice was shaking with rage, screaming at me about what I'd done, calling me ungrateful and spiteful and evil. She said I'd destroyed her son's life out of pettiness, that I was a vindictive witch who couldn't handle being put in her place. I let her rant for about 30 seconds. Then I interrupted her very calmly and said that her son destroyed his own life the moment he decided to steal from his company, and I'd destroyed my own life by staying with him as long as I had. I told her that the spit on my face was the wake-up call I'd needed, and I should actually thank her for applauding it because it had given me perfect clarity about what kind of people they all were. Then I hung up and blocked all 3 of their numbers. The silence that followed was beautiful. I finished packing, called my best friend Rachel, and asked if I could stay with her for a few weeks, and she said yes before I even finished the question. She lived across town in a little apartment in the Midtown area, and she'd been telling me for years that Marcus was no good for me. I'd defended him every time, made excuses, insisted that she just didn't understand our relationship. But she'd never said I told you so, not once, and I loved her for that. I loaded up my car with as much as I could fit. took one last look around the apartment, and left my keys on the kitchen counter. I didn't leave a note. I didn't owe Marcus or his family any explanations or goodbyes. I just walked out and didn't look back, and the Atlanta skyline in the evening light had never looked more beautiful, like the whole city was celebrating my freedom with me. The next few days were a blur of activity. I filed for divorce the very next morning, and my lawyer, a sharp woman named Michelle who Rachel had recommended, said it would be straightforward since we had no kids and no shared property. Georgia's a no-fault divorce state, which meant I didn't have to prove Marcus's infidelity or abuse or anything else. I just had to prove we'd lived separately, and the marriage was irretrievably broken, which was the easiest thing in the world to demonstrate. Word spread fast about what had happened at Marcus's job. He ended up resigning before they could fire him, but David made sure that everyone in their industry knew why. Marcus would never work as an engineer in Atlanta again, probably not anywhere in the Southeast. His reputation was ruined, and the crazy thing was, I didn't feel bad about it. I'd spent so many years feeling guilty every time I stood up for myself, every time I asked for the bare minimum of respect, but this time, I felt nothing but relief. If you're still with me on this journey, if you're feeling that sense of justice and empowerment, do me a favor right now and subscribe to this channel. Click that red button and help us build something amazing together. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and your click makes a real difference. Join this community of people who refuse to be treated like doormats. About a week after I left, Jennifer showed up at Rachel's apartment building. I don't know how she found out where I was staying, but she stood outside buzzing the intercom over and over until I finally came down to talk to her. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in days, and her voice was hoarse when she started talking. She said the family was falling apart, that Marcus was having a breakdown, that Patricia was so stressed she'd ended up in the hospital with chest pains. She begged me to recant my statement to David, to say I'd made it all up, to fix what I'd broken. I just stared at her for a long moment, remembering the sound of her applause, while her brother's spit dripped down my face. Then I told her that I hadn't broken anything. Marcus had broken his own integrity when he stole from his company. Patricia had broken her own health by spending years building her son into a man who thought he could treat women like property, and Jennifer had broken any chance of my sympathy when she'd clapped and laughed at my humiliation. I told her that sometimes broken things don't get fixed. They just stay broken, and that's exactly what they deserved. She called me a monster and said I'd regret this, that karma would come for me. I told her karma had already come, just not for the person she thought. Then I went back inside and never saw her again. Rachel had been watching from the window, and when I came back upstairs, she just hugged me and said she was proud of me. That meant more than Jennifer's opinion ever could. The divorce moved forward quickly. Marcus tried to fight it at first, sent his lawyer to meetings demanding I pay him spousal support since I'd ruined his career and he couldn't work. But Michelle shut that down fast, presenting evidence of his theft and arguing that his unemployment was a consequence of his own criminal behavior, not my actions. The judge agreed, and Marcus ended up with nothing. We split what little shared property we had down the middle, and I walked away from the marriage with my dignity and my bank account intact. During those weeks of legal proceedings, I learned things about Marcus that I'd never known. He'd been having an emotional affair with a coworker for the past year. He'd taken out credit cards in both our names without telling me and racked up nearly $30,000 in debt, mostly on gambling websites. He'd lied to me about where he was going most evenings, claiming he was working late when he was actually at bars or casinos. Our entire marriage had been built on lies, and I'd been too trusting or too naive or too desperate to believe in love to see it. But here's the thing I realized during all of this, the thing that changed my entire perspective on what had happened that day in his mother's living room. That moment when Marcus spit on me wasn't the worst thing that had ever happened to me. It was the best thing. Because it was so shocking, so undeniably horrible, that it broke through all my defenses and all my excuses and forced me to see the truth. If he'd just yelled at me again, If Patricia had just made another snide comment, I probably would have apologized and tried harder and stayed trapped in that toxic cycle for years more. But you can't make excuses for someone spitting in your face. You can't rationalize that away or blame yourself for it. It was clear and simple and undeniable, and it set me free. 3 months after I walked out of that house, I was sitting in a coffee shop in Midtown, early on a Saturday morning, reading a book and drinking an iced latte. The Atlanta summer heat was already building, even though it was barely 9 a.m., and the coffee shop was full of people working on laptops or meeting friends or just enjoying the weekend. I was completely absorbed in my book when someone said my name, and I looked up to see David Chen standing there with his own coffee, smiling at me. We ended up talking for over an hour, sitting at one of those little tables by the window while the city woke up around us. He told me that the company had recovered most of the money Marcus had stolen and that they'd decided not to press criminal charges in exchange for full restitution. He said he'd felt bad about that at first. Felt like Marcus was getting off too easy. But then he'd thought about how my phone call had probably saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars in the long run by catching the theft early. He thanked me again for my integrity, for doing the right thing even though it must have been incredibly difficult. I told him the truth, which was that it hadn't been difficult at all. The difficult part had been staying silent for those 3 months when I'd first found out, lying to myself about why I wasn't reporting it, pretending it was about protecting my marriage when it was really about being afraid to blow up my life. The phone call had been easy. Standing up for myself had been easy. It was all the years of making myself small and quiet and accommodating that had been hard. Before you hear about what happened next, about how my life transformed in ways I never could have imagined, take a moment and click subscribe if you haven't already. Help us reach that 1,000 subscriber goal. Be part of this community that's all about supporting each other through difficult times and celebrating when we come out stronger on the other side. David and I started meeting for coffee regularly after that, just as friends at first. He was going through his own divorce, had been separated from his wife for almost a year, and we found comfort in each other's company. We'd talk about work and books and our plans for the future, and slowly I realized I was building a life that was entirely my own, not defined by anyone else's expectations or approval. I got promoted at work, moved into my own apartment in a building with a view of the city, started taking salsa dancing classes just because I'd always wanted to, and Marcus had always said it was stupid. I reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with because Marcus hadn't liked them. I traveled to places I'd always wanted to visit, but he'd vetoed because they weren't his idea of fun. I spent holidays with my family for the first time in years, and my mother cried when she saw me because she said I looked happy again, like I'd been carrying darkness around and finally put it down. She was right. I had been carrying darkness, the weight of constantly trying to be someone I wasn't, and I'd finally set it down that day when I walked out of Patricia's house with spit on my face and fire in my heart. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Marcus had moved back in with his mother. He was working a series of temporary jobs, nothing in his field, struggling to make ends meet. Patricia had apparently suffered a minor stroke from the stress of everything, though she'd recovered. Jennifer had stopped speaking to Marcus entirely, blaming him for the family's downfall. The empire they'd built their identity around, this perfect family image they'd worked so hard to maintain, had crumbled completely. I wish I could say I felt sorry for them, but I didn't. Not even a little bit. They'd made their choices, same as I'd made mine. The difference was that my choices had led to freedom and growth and genuine happiness, while theirs had led to exactly the kind of misery they'd always tried to inflict on others. That's not karma being cruel. That's just consequences, plain and simple. A year after everything fell apart, David asked me out on a real date, not just coffee as friends. We went to this beautiful restaurant overlooking the city, one of those places with floor-to-ceiling windows where you can see all of Atlanta spread out below you like a blanket of lights. Over dinner, he told me he'd been falling in love with me slowly over the past months, watching me rebuild my life and become this strong, confident woman who knew her own worth. He said he understood if I wasn't ready, if I needed more time after everything I'd been through, and he'd wait as long as I needed. But I didn't need more time. I'd spent 4 years of my life waiting, hoping, trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. I was done waiting. I told David yes, that I'd like to see where this could go, and that kiss goodnight in the parking garage was the beginning of something real. Something built on mutual respect and genuine affection, instead of manipulation and control. We took things slow, really slow, but every step forward felt right in a way that nothing with Marcus ever had. Now, 2 years after that day in Patricia's living room, I'm engaged to David. We're planning a small wedding, just close friends and family, nothing like the huge production Marcus's mother had insisted on the first time around. I'm working as a legal assistant now, back in school part-time getting my law degree because I finally have the space and support to chase my dreams. David encourages me, celebrates every milestone, treats me like an equal partner in every decision we make. His family welcomed me with open arms, no judgment, no criticism, just genuine warmth. I still think about that moment sometimes, standing in that living room with 3 people who were supposed to love me celebrating my humiliation. But I don't think about it with pain or shame anymore. I think about it with gratitude, because that was the moment I stopped being a victim and started being a survivor. That was the moment I learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us are actually doorways to better lives, if we're brave enough to walk through them. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to make the choice to walk away from people who claim to love you, but really just wanted to control you, I want to hear from you in the comments. But first, if you haven't already subscribed, please do it now. Click that red button and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Every subscription tells YouTube that these stories matter, that your stories matter, and it helps us grow this community of people supporting each other. Marcus tried to reach out to me once, about 18 months after the divorce. He sent a long email apologizing for everything, saying he'd been in therapy and realized how badly he'd treated me. He said he'd been dealing with a gambling addiction, and that stress from his mother and pressure to be perfect had driven him to make terrible choices. He asked if we could meet for coffee to talk, said he wanted closure. I read the email 3 times, trying to feel something, trying to find even a shred of the love I'd once felt for him. But there was nothing there, just emptiness where pain used to be. I never responded to that email. Some people deserve closure, and some people deserve silence. And Marcus had shown me through his actions which one he'd earned. I hope he's doing better now. I genuinely do. But his healing journey isn't my responsibility anymore. I spent too many years making his problems my problems, sacrificing my own well-being for his comfort. I was done with that. I had my own life to live, my own happiness to protect. The last I heard, Patricia had sold the house and moved into a retirement community. Jennifer had gotten married to someone I didn't know and moved to Florida. Marcus was still living in Atlanta somewhere, still working jobs that were beneath his education level, still paying off the debts he'd accumulated. Their family gatherings must be awkward now, or maybe they don't have them anymore. I wouldn't know. I removed myself completely from their orbit, and it was the healthiest decision I ever made. Here's what I want you to understand. If you're in a situation like I was, if you're reading this and seeing yourself in my story, you don't have to wait for someone to spit in your face to leave. You don't have to hit rock bottom before you decide you deserve better. The moment you realize you're not being treated with basic human dignity and respect, that's the moment you have permission to walk away. You don't owe anyone your suffering. You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe anyone continued chances to hurt you just because they're family, or because you've invested time in the relationship, or because leaving feels scary. Leaving is scary. I won't lie about that. The weeks after I left were some of the most terrifying of my life, full of uncertainty and doubt, and moments where I questioned whether I'd made the right choice. But you know what was scarier? The thought of spending the rest of my life in that house, in that family, with that man, slowly losing pieces of myself until there was nothing left. The thought of looking back at 70 years old and realizing I'd wasted my one precious life trying to win the approval of people who were never going to give it. That was scarier than any uncertainty, any financial struggle, any social judgment. And here's the beautiful thing about walking away from toxicity. You think you're going to lose everything, but what you actually lose is just the weight. The people who truly love you will understand and support you. The opportunities you thought you'd miss out on will be replaced by better opportunities you never imagined. The life you thought you needed will be revealed as the cage it always was, and beyond that cage is a whole world of possibility waiting for you to step into it. If you're feeling inspired right now, if this story has given you hope or courage or just made you feel less alone, show your support by subscribing to this channel. We're building something special here, a community of 1,000 strong survivors and supporters, and I want you to be part of it. Hit that subscribe button right now and join us. I went back to that neighborhood once, about a year after everything happened. I don't know why I did it exactly. Maybe just to prove to myself that I could, that those streets didn't have power over me anymore. I drove past Patricia's old house, saw that it had new owners, a young couple with a baby stroller on the front porch. The garden looked different, more colorful, less rigid and perfect. It made me smile to think about new life happening in that space, new stories that had nothing to do with the darkness that had lived there before. I drove past the coffee shop where Marcus and I used to get breakfast on Sunday mornings, past the park where we'd taken walks in the early days of dating, when everything still felt possible. None of it hurt anymore. It was just geography, just buildings and streets with no emotional weight. The memories were still there, but they felt distant, like something that had happened to a different person in a different life. In a way, they had. The person I am now would never tolerate what the person I was then accepted as normal. The person I am now knows her worth, sets boundaries, walks away from disrespect without hesitation. The person I am now understands that love shouldn't require you to make yourself smaller, quieter, less than who you are. Real love, healthy love, the kind I have with David now, makes you bigger, braver, more fully yourself. It celebrates your strength instead of trying to diminish it. David and I talk about that day sometimes, about the phone call that connected us in a way we never expected. He jokes that Marcus's worst day was our meet cute story, and there's something beautifully ironic about that. Out of Marcus's greed and my heartbreak came something genuine and good. And sometimes I think that's the universe's way of balancing the scales. You take from others, you lose everything. You stand up for what's right even when it's hard, and you get rewarded in ways you never anticipated. My relationship with my own family has healed too. They never said it directly, but I know they'd been worried about me for years, watching me shrink and change, and lose my spark trying to fit into Marcus's world. My mother told me recently that she'd prayed every night that I'd find the strength to leave, but she'd never pushed me because she knew I had to come to that decision on my own. The relief in her voice when she talks about my life now, the joy she takes in seeing me happy, it makes me realize how much my pain affected the people who truly loved me. I want to finish this story by telling you about something that happened just last month, something that brought everything full circle in a way I never could have predicted. David and I were at a charity gala for his company, one of those formal events where everyone dresses up and pretends to enjoy tiny portions of expensive food while networking and making small talk. I was wearing this emerald green dress that made me feel confident and beautiful, my engagement ring catching the light every time I moved my hand, and I was genuinely happy to be there supporting David and the causes his company championed. We were standing near the bar, laughing about something one of his colleagues had said, when I saw her across the room. Patricia. She was thinner than I remembered, her hair completely gray now instead of the dyed brown she'd always maintained, and she was wearing a dress that looked expensive but somehow worn, like she'd owned it for years and kept bringing it out for occasions like this. She was alone, standing near one of the tall cocktail tables, clutching a glass of wine, and looking uncomfortable in a way that made her seem smaller than the woman who used to fill rooms with her commanding presence. Our eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and I saw recognition flash across her face, followed immediately by something that looked like shame, or maybe fear. For a moment, I thought she might turn and walk away, disappear into the crowd and pretend she hadn't seen me. But she didn't. She set down her wine glass, straightened her shoulders in that way she always did when she was preparing for confrontation, and walked directly toward me. David noticed the change in my posture, the way I'd gone still and tense, and he squeezed my hand gently, silently asking if I was okay. Patricia stopped a few feet away from us, close enough to talk without shouting, but maintaining a careful distance, like she wasn't sure if she was welcome in my space. Her voice when she spoke was different than I remembered, softer, less certain. She said my name, just my first name, and then she said she was sorry. Not sorry for disturbing me at the gala, not sorry for the inconvenience of this encounter, but sorry for everything. Sorry for the way she'd treated me during my marriage to her son. Sorry for the terrible things she'd said and done. Sorry for applauding when Marcus spit in my face. The people around us had started to notice the tension, conversations quieting as they sensed drama unfolding. I could feel their eyes on us, their curiosity about this interaction between two women who clearly had history. David stood close to me, his presence solid and supportive. But he didn't interfere, didn't try to speak for me or protect me from this conversation. He trusted me to handle it however I needed to, and that trust meant everything. I looked at Patricia for a long moment, really looked at her, and I could see that the past 2 years had not been kind. The lines around her eyes were deeper, the set of her mouth harder, like someone who'd spent too much time tasting bitterness. She looked like a woman who'd lost things she'd thought she could never lose, who'd learned lessons she'd never wanted to learn. Part of me, the part that still remembered being that young woman desperate for this woman's approval, wanted to feel sympathy. But mostly I just felt tired, like this confrontation was the final piece of a puzzle I'd already finished and put away. Before I tell you what I said to her, I want to ask you something. If you've made it this far in this story, if you've stayed with me through all of these twists and turns and difficult moments, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. You understand that real life is complicated, that healing isn't linear, that standing up for yourself is both the hardest and most important thing you can do. Subscribe right now if you haven't already. Click that button and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Be part of this community that believes in growth and change and refusing to accept less than we deserve. I told Patricia that I accepted her apology, not because I forgave her, but because I didn't want to carry the weight of her guilt along with everything else I'd already survived. I told her that what she did was unforgivable, that applauding while her son humiliated me was one of the cruelest things I'd ever experienced, but that I'd moved past it and built a beautiful life without any of them in it. I told her I hoped she'd learned something from watching her family fall apart, that maybe she'd treat the next woman in Marcus's life with more respect, but that ultimately her growth or lack of it wasn't my concern anymore. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly, like she'd expected this response and accepted that it was what she deserved. She said Marcus was doing better now, that he was in therapy and working on himself, that he'd met someone new who seemed good for him. She said Jennifer had reconciled with him after the birth of her first child. That family ties had proven stronger than the anger and blame. She said she'd sold the house because it held too many bad memories, that she was living smaller now, simpler, trying to figure out who she was without the perfect family image she'd built her identity around. I listened to all of this with a strange sort of detachment, like she was telling me about strangers I'd read about in a book, rather than people who'd once been central to my life. I was glad Marcus was doing better, genuinely. I was glad they were healing as a family. But none of it touched me anymore. None of it had anything to do with the life I was living now. That chapter was closed. The book was on the shelf, and I'd moved on to a completely different story. Patricia asked if she could meet David, and I almost said no, almost told her she didn't have the right to be introduced to the man I was building a future with. But David stepped forward on his own, extending his hand with professional courtesy, saying it was nice to meet her, even though I knew he'd heard enough stories to dislike her intensely. He was doing it for me, showing Patricia that I'd found someone who treated me with respect and kindness, someone who stood beside me instead of trying to stand over me. It was a subtle message, but a powerful one, and I saw Patricia understand it immediately. The conversation ended shortly after that, Patricia excusing herself and disappearing back into the crowd. David pulled me close and asked if I was okay, if I needed to leave, if I needed anything at all. I told him I was fine. Better than fine, actually. Because seeing Patricia again had confirmed something I'd suspected, but never quite believed. I didn't miss that life. I didn't miss those people. I didn't even miss the version of myself who'd tried so hard to make it all work. I'd evolved past all of it, and there was a freedom in that realization that felt like flying. The rest of the gala passed in a blur of conversations and dancing and laughter, and I didn't think about Patricia again until we were driving home in the early hours of the morning, Atlanta's downtown lights reflecting off the hood of David's car. He asked me what I was thinking about, and I told him the truth, which was that I was thinking about how random life is, how one terrible moment can change everything, how walking away from something that's destroying you can feel impossible until you actually do it, and then you wonder why you waited so long. We talked about the wedding, about our plans for the future, about whether we wanted kids, and where we wanted to travel, and what kind of life we wanted to build together. Everything felt possible in that car ride home, like the world was full of open doors instead of locked cages. That's what real partnership feels like, I realized. Not like you're constantly trying to prove yourself worthy of love, but like love is the foundation you're building everything else on top of. If you're listening to this and thinking about your own life, about relationships that drain you, or family members who diminish you, or situations where you're not being treated with basic respect, I want you to know something important. You don't need permission to leave. You don't need a dramatic moment like someone spitting in your face. You don't need to wait until things get so bad that you have no other choice. The moment you realize you're not happy, the moment you recognize that you're giving more than you're receiving, and it's destroying you slowly, that's the moment you can choose differently. Choosing differently is terrifying. I understand that more than you know. The fear of the unknown, the fear of being alone, the fear of financial instability or social judgment, or proving everyone who doubted you right. Those fears are real and valid. But you know what's more terrifying? Waking up 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and realizing you've spent your entire life trying to win the approval of people who were never going to give it. Realizing you've sacrificed your dreams and your peace and your very self on the altar of other people's expectations. I'm not going to lie to you and say that leaving Marcus and his family was easy, or that my life immediately became perfect. Those first few months were hard. I cried a lot. I doubted myself constantly. I had moments where I almost picked up the phone and apologized, almost convinced myself that maybe I'd overreacted, maybe I should give him another chance. But I didn't. Because somewhere deep inside me, I knew that going back would be like choosing to drown when someone had just thrown me a lifeline. And slowly, day by day, week by week, things got better. I started sleeping through the night again without nightmares. I started making decisions based on what I wanted instead of what someone else would approve of. I started recognizing myself in the mirror again, seeing the woman I'd been before I'd tried to shrink myself down to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be. That woman had always been there, just waiting for permission to exist fully. And walking away from Marcus gave her that permission. The career success came next, almost like the universe was rewarding me for finally choosing myself. The promotion I'd been passed over for repeatedly suddenly became available, and this time there was no Marcus telling me I didn't need it. No Patricia suggesting it would be selfish to prioritize work over family. I applied, I interviewed, and I got it. The raise that came with it meant I could afford my own apartment, could stop relying on Rachel's generosity, could start building financial independence that no one could take away from me. Then came the friendships, real ones, with people who liked me for who I actually was instead of who I was trying to be. Rachel introduced me to her book club, and suddenly, I had Thursday nights filled with wine and laughter and discussions about literature that made me feel intellectually alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. One of the women in that book club, a lawyer named Sandra, became a mentor to me, encouraging me to go back to school, helping me study for the LSAT, believing in me when I still wasn't sure I believed in myself. Take a moment right now. If you're feeling inspired by this journey, if you're thinking about your own path to freedom and happiness, and subscribe to this channel. Help us build this community of people who refuse to settle for less than they deserve. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, and every single one matters. Click that red button and join us in creating a space where these stories are told and heard and valued. The relationship with David developed naturally, without any of the red flags or warning signs I'd ignored with Marcus. He never tried to change me or control me or make me feel small. He celebrated my successes instead of feeling threatened by them. When I got into law school, he threw me a party and told everyone who would listen how proud he was of me. When I had doubts about whether I could handle school and work at the same time, he reminded me of everything I'd already survived and told me that if I could walk away from an abusive marriage with nothing but a suitcase and rebuild my entire life, I could absolutely handle a course load. That's the difference between someone who loves you and someone who wants to own you. Someone who loves you sees your potential and helps you reach it. Someone who wants to own you sees your potential and fears it, tries to cut you down to a manageable size so you'll never outgrow your need for them. Marcus had been trying to own me, and I'd been so desperate to be loved that I'd mistaken ownership for commitment. I started this channel about 6 months ago because I realized my story wasn't unique. I'd meet women everywhere, at the coffee shop, at the gym, at school, who would confide in me about their own situations. Partners who belittled them, family members who controlled them, friends who drained them, and they all had the same look in their eyes that I recognized from my own mirror 3 years ago. That desperate exhaustion of someone who's trying so hard to make something work that's fundamentally broken. I wanted to create a space where women like me, like you, could hear stories of survival and know that walking away is possible. That life on the other side of that terrifying decision is not just possible, but beautiful. That you don't have to accept disrespect and abuse just because it comes wrapped in the language of love and family. So I started recording my story, and the response has been overwhelming. Messages from women all over the world telling me that hearing my experience gave them courage to leave their own toxic situations. One woman wrote me last week, saying she'd been planning to stay in her marriage for the sake of her children, convinced that any father was better than no father, until she heard this story. She realized she was teaching her daughters that it was acceptable for men to treat women terribly, and she was teaching her sons that this was how relationships worked. She left 3 days after listening to my story, and she said my voice in her head telling her she deserved better was what got her through the moment when her husband tried to convince her to stay. That message made me cry. The good kind of crying that comes from knowing your pain meant something, that your experience can light the way for someone else stumbling in the dark. That's why I do this. That's why I'm asking you to subscribe and be part of this community. Because every person who finds these videos and hears these stories is one more person who knows they're not alone, one more person who might find the courage to choose themselves. My wedding to David is planned for this fall, October 15th to be exact. We're getting married in a small ceremony at a botanical garden here in Atlanta. Just our closest friends and family. My parents are flying in from California, where they retired last year, and my mother has already cried twice during planning conversations because she's so happy to see me with someone who treats me well. David's parents have welcomed me like a daughter, no criticism, no judgment, just open arms and genuine affection. We're not having a big production because neither of us wants that. We've both been married before, both learned that expensive weddings and perfect venues don't make marriages strong. What makes marriages strong is mutual respect, honest communication, shared values, and the daily choice to show up for each other even when it's hard. Those things don't require a fancy ceremony or a designer dress or approval from people who don't matter. Marcus sent a wedding gift last month, which arrived completely unexpectedly. It was a set of wine glasses with a note saying he was happy I'd found happiness, and he hoped I could forgive him someday. I wasn't sure what to do with it at first, whether accepting it would be weakness or returning it would be pettiness. David said it was my choice entirely, that he'd support whatever I decided. I ended up keeping the glasses but donating them to a women's shelter, along with a note saying they were from someone who'd learned too late how to treat women with respect, and maybe someone else could drink from them while building a better life. It felt like the right ending to that chapter, turning something from my past into something that might help someone else's future. The women at that shelter were survivors like me. Women who'd walked away from abuse and violence and control. And if those glasses could sit on their tables during meals where they were safe and supported, then maybe some good could come from all the bad that had happened. I'm finishing law school next year, and I've already accepted a position at a firm that specializes in family law, specifically helping women navigate divorce and custody battles. It feels like everything I went through was preparation for this work, giving me insight and empathy that I never could have developed otherwise. When I sit across from a woman who's trying to leave an abusive marriage but is terrified of losing everything, I can look her in the eye and tell her from experience that losing everything is sometimes the only way to gain yourself back. The firm I'm joining is run by 3 women who all survived their own difficult divorces, who all rebuilt their lives and now spend their days helping other women do the same. They told me during my interview that they could see the fire in me. That particular determination that comes from having survived something that should have broken you but didn't. They said I'd be an asset to their clients because I'd understand not just the legal process but the emotional journey. And they were right. I think about that day in Patricia's living room all the time, but not with pain anymore. I think about it with gratitude, because it was the catalyst for everything good that came after. If Marcus had been just a little bit less horrible, if he'd just yelled at me or given me the silent treatment, or done any of the other controlling things he'd done before, I probably would have stayed. I probably would have apologized and tried harder and continued sacrificing myself on the altar of a marriage that was killing me slowly. But you can't ignore someone spitting in your face. You can't rationalize it or minimize it or convince yourself it wasn't that bad. It's visceral and shocking and undeniably wrong. And it gave me the clarity I needed to see everything else clearly, too. Sometimes we need that moment of absolute clarity, that thing that's so terrible it cuts through all our defenses and excuses and lets us see the truth we've been avoiding. If you're waiting for that moment in your own life, I want to tell you something important. You don't have to wait. You don't need someone to spit in your face to have permission to leave. The emotional abuse, the controlling behavior, the constant criticism, the way they make you feel small and worthless, those things are enough. You don't have to wait for it to get physical or for something so dramatic that everyone else will understand why you left. You can leave because you're unhappy. You can leave because you deserve better. You can leave because you want to. And when you do leave, when you walk out that door and start building a life that's entirely your own, you're going to doubt yourself. You're going to have moments where you wonder if you made the right choice. You're going to feel guilty and scared and overwhelmed. But I promise you with everything I have, that those feelings will pass, and what will remain is freedom. The freedom to be fully yourself, to make your own choices, to build a life that reflects your values and dreams instead of someone else's control. Show your support for this message, for this community of survivors and supporters, by subscribing right now. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers and build something amazing together. Click that red button and be part of a movement that says, we deserve respect, we deserve love, we deserve lives that don't require us to shrink ourselves down to nothing. I ran into Jennifer about 3 months ago, completely by chance, at a grocery store on the other side of town. We were both reaching for the same box of cereal, and our hands touched, and we both looked up at the same time and recognized each other. The shock on her face was almost comical, and for a second I thought she might just turn around and walk away. But she didn't. She pulled her hand back, let me take the cereal box, and then she did something I never expected. She apologized. She said she'd been thinking about me a lot lately, especially since having her daughter, imagining how she'd feel if someone treated her daughter the way they'd all treated me. She said becoming a mother had given her perspective on a lot of things, made her realize that her loyalty to her brother and mother had made her complicit in cruelty. She said she was ashamed of the person she'd been that day, ashamed of applauding, ashamed of standing by while her brother abused me for years. I didn't know what to say at first, because her apology felt genuine in a way Patricia's hadn't. Jennifer looked different too, softer somehow, like motherhood had worn away some of her sharp edges. She showed me pictures of her daughter, a beautiful baby girl with dark curls and Jennifer's eyes, and she said she was terrified of raising her daughter in a world where women were treated the way Marcus had treated me. She said she wanted to do better, be better, raise her daughter to never accept that kind of treatment, and her sons, if she had them, to never dish it out. We talked for maybe 20 minutes there in the cereal aisle, and it was strange and uncomfortable, but also somehow healing. I told her I didn't forgive her, not completely, but I appreciated her apology, and I believed she meant it. I told her that the best thing she could do with her guilt was use it as fuel to be better, to raise her daughter with the self-respect and boundaries I'd had to learn the hard way. She agreed, said that was exactly what she planned to do, and then we said goodbye and went our separate ways. I haven't spoken to her since, and I probably never will again. But that encounter stayed with me. It reminded me that people can change, that sometimes cruelty comes from ignorance rather than malice, and that having your own children can shift your perspective in profound ways. It didn't erase what she'd done, didn't make the applause any less painful in my memory, but it added a layer of complexity to the story that felt important somehow. David and I talk about having children someday, after I finish school and get established in my career. The idea terrifies me and excites me in equal measure, because I know what kind of mother I want to be, and I know exactly what kind of mother I don't want to be. I want to raise children who understand that love should never require you to make yourself smaller. I want to raise daughters who know their worth is inherent, not something they have to earn through pleasing others. I want to raise sons who understand that strength means lifting others up, not tearing them down. Sometimes I imagine my future daughter asking me about her father, about David, and why he's so different from other men. And I imagine telling her this story, age-appropriately, of course, helping her understand that I almost settled for terrible treatment because I didn't know I deserved better. I imagine using my past as a teaching moment, showing her that walking away from bad situations is possible and necessary and brave. I imagine raising her in a home where respect is the baseline, not the exception, where her voice matters and her boundaries are honored. That future feels real and possible in a way that nothing felt when I was with Marcus. Back then, every plan for the future was clouded with anxiety. Every decision filtered through whether it would upset Marcus or Patricia or Jennifer. Now, the future is this bright open space full of possibility, and David and I get to fill it however we choose. That's what freedom feels like, the ability to make choices based on what you want, rather than what you fear. The podcast I mentioned earlier, this channel where I share these stories, has grown beyond what I ever imagined. We're almost at 1,000 subscribers, just a few dozen away, and each new subscriber feels like a victory. It means one more person has found these stories. One more person knows they're not alone. One more person might find the courage to choose themselves. If you haven't subscribed yet, if you've been listening this whole time without clicking that button, now is the moment. Help us reach 1,000. Be part of this community. Click subscribe right now. I want to end this story by telling you what I wish someone had told me 6 years ago when I first started dating Marcus, when the red flags were there, but I was too inexperienced or too hopeful to see them. I wish someone had sat me down and explained that love shouldn't make you smaller, that a partner who truly cares about you will celebrate your successes, not feel threatened by them. That family, whether biological or chosen, should build you up, not tear you down. That you don't owe anyone continued access to your life just because you've given them access in the past. I wish someone had told me that walking away from toxicity isn't giving up, it's growing up. That choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. That being alone is better than being with someone who makes you feel alone even when you're together. That the fear of starting over is temporary, but the regret of staying in a bad situation lasts forever. That you don't have to wait for permission or validation or the perfect moment to leave. You just have to decide that you're worth more than what you're accepting. Most importantly, I wish someone had told me that my worth wasn't determined by whether Marcus and his family accepted me, that their rejection of me said everything about their limitations and nothing about my value, that people who need to diminish others to feel powerful are actually the weakest people in the room, that walking away from their approval was the first step toward finding my own. So I'm telling you now, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever situation you're in, that made you listen to this entire story. You are worth more than whatever disrespect you're accepting. You deserve a life that doesn't require you to shrink or hide or apologize for existing fully. You have permission to walk away from anyone and anything that makes you feel less than. You don't need a dramatic moment to justify leaving. Your unhappiness is reason enough. And when you do leave, when you take that terrifying step into the unknown, I want you to remember this story. Remember that on the other side of that fear is freedom. On the other side of that pain is peace. On the other side of that ending is a beginning more beautiful than anything you could have imagined while you were still trapped in that situation. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it. I promise you that with everything I have. It will be worth it. 3 years ago, I stood in a living room with spit on my face, surrounded by people who claimed to love me but really just wanted to control me, and I made a choice. I chose myself. I walked out that door, made one phone call, and changed the trajectory of my entire life. Every good thing that's happened since that day, every moment of happiness and peace and genuine love, it all started with that single choice to say, enough is enough. You have that same choice available to you right now. You don't have to wait for someone to spit in your face. You don't have to wait for things to get worse. You don't have to wait at all. You can choose yourself today, this moment, right now. And when you do, when you walk away from whatever is diminishing you, I'll be here in this community we're building, cheering you on, believing in you, reminding you that you made the right choice. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Be part of a community that believes in the power of walking away, the strength of starting over, and the beauty of choosing yourself. Click that red button right now and join us. My name is Emma, and I'm no longer that woman who stood in a living room accepting cruelty because I'd convinced myself I didn't deserve better. I'm the woman who walked away, who rebuilt, who found real love, who's going to spend the rest of her life helping other women find their way out of the darkness. And if my story can light the path for even one person, then every terrible moment I survived was worth it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this journey. Now go subscribe, and then go choose yourself. You deserve it.